Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 and AP English, and we are now in the Iliad Book 13 lecture, what Fagles calls battling for the ships. Now, let's just remind ourselves here what I think we've already said, but let's put it in our notes just to be sure. We're talking about the longest day. Fully 1/3 of the Iliad is actually just a single day. This sometimes shocks students when they pick up the Iliad and they read it for the first time, that so much can happen in this poem that's specific to a 24-hour period. But what's, I think, being attempted by the poet Homer is the ability to show multiple activities that are kind of simultaneously happening. Now, the longest day starts in Book 11, when Zeus will send Iris to Hector and say, until the sun goes down, after Agamemnon has been wounded, you will have the ascension, okay? And so then we have this long day that will actually end in Book 18, roughly around line 240 or so, okay? So you've got a whole lot that's going to happen in this single day. But the thing I want to point out, and we'll mention this a little bit later in our lecture, the reflexive reading of the Iliad, as scholars have sometimes called it, is that you have two different kinds of ways of looking at the longest day. You have the actions that are happening that are human, and you have the actions that are happening that are God's, okay? And so there's going to be this kind of interesting intermingling. We're going to see this right away here. Now, if you haven't been following my my lectures on LearnStrong.net, I recommend that you go there, find the AP folder, and find our lectures. Let's just do a quick review, as we are often want to do. At Book 1, of course, the invocation of the Muse, Agamemnon and Achilles fall out over a couple of women, and of course then we have the rest of the action of this poem. At Book 2, we have Agamemnon's bad dream that Zeus will send to him, telling him that the Greeks in fact will win, when in fact they're going to get crushed for a while at least. And we have the catalog of the ships, catalog of the chariots, just to show that this is in fact a monumental contest between all different kinds of peoples. In Book 3, we have Paris, who's going to go one-on-one against Menelaus. Menelaus gets the upper hand. Looks like everything is going to be taken care of and the war is over. Book 4, Zeus and Hera have a conversation where Hera says, absolutely no way. Pandarus is then going to shoot at Menelaus, wound him, and the war then continues. In Book 5, we have Diomedes' Aristeia. Now again, that word will come back here, Aristeia, that typeset, type scene that shows a certain kind of warrior ready to fight, and he will in fact, Diomedes will in fact wound both Aphrodite and Ares. In Book 6, pivotal book, we have Hector back in the walls of Troy for the last time with his wife Andromache and his young boy Astyanax, and that's such a powerful moment because it will inform this longest day, which is for much of the longest day is Hector's Aristeia, his great battles. In Book 7 we have Ajax against Hector, where there is a truce. That's significant because in this book we're going to come back to this again, where Ajax and Hector have had already a standoff, and so when they meet each other, for example in Book 13, they're less inclined to be ready to jump at each other's throats. In Book 8 we have the famous Zeus's scales, where the Trojans and Hector, it's determined, will in fact begin now to dominate. In Book 9, of course then, the Greeks, and especially Agamemnon, realize that he made a mistake and sends the embassy to Achilles, Odysseus, Phinox, and Ajax, and Achilles says, no, I'm not interested in it, I am not coming back. I gave a review of Books 1 through 9 that I definitely feel is an important moment in our study. I called it Achilles' crisis of faith, where he rejects in a speech to Odysseus, and the other two obviously, both time, that notion that honor is such an integral part of the warrior's life, Scooby snacks in other words, and he also rejects kleos, that notion that glory and the way people talk about you after you're dead is also important. He rejects both of those, and in the process of doing so, he's kind of left uncertain as to what will be the most important things in his life. In Book 10, Diomedes and Odysseus have their night raid. They will, of course, do all kinds of nasties, and they will kill the Trojan Dolan. In Book 11, we have Agamemnon's Aristeia. And ultimately, then, this will lead to the wounding of the healer, Achilles wanting to know about that, sending Patroclus to Nestor. And at the end of Book 11, it is then fated, as it's said in the text, that from that day on, it's only a matter of time before Patroclus is going to enter the war and to be killed by the great Hector. In Book 12, we have the fighting at the trench and at the wall, the ramparts, and we have the famous boulder of Hector that will jack the gates open. In Book 13 now, we're ready to come to Book 13. We're going to see now the role that Poseidon will play. All right? Now, again, the hope here is that you're annotating on your own. By this point, if you've been studying with me consistently of the Iliad, you ought to be able to now pick up and read this stuff on your own, and then just use me as a way, a means of helping you read this. Reminding you, our learning theory suggests that we're constantly looking to connect new information to old information in meaningful ways, and our 3 levels of annotative reading do that at level 1, answering the question, what does the text say? At level 2, what does the text mean? 2a, themes, messages. And at 2b, the rhetorical level, we're asking here in our study about symbolism and about irony. We're going to see a bit of both in Book 13. Finally, at level 3, we're asking, how can I relate to this information in meaningful ways? At 3a, other texts, beginning, of course, with the preceding books of the Iliad. And then finally, how can I relate to this personally myself? Let's do a real quick review of Book 13, as we often do, and then we'll get to the actual lines. Zeus will leave in the opening lines. There's some irony already in the opening line. Zeus will leave, assuming that no gods are going to get involved. Poseidon, his brother, does get involved, but he gets involved as Calchas, the great seer, the great prophet, the great speaker, Calchas, and he helps the Greeks by challenging them in some pivotal speeches that we'll be looking at. Poseidon especially will help the 2 Iasus, the 2 Ajax men, okay? Ajax the larger, Ajax the smaller. We're told that the Greeks follow Ajax the larger a little bit more than they follow Ajax the smaller, right? We have lots of killing on both sides. Ajax and Hector come to a standoff, kind of like we said in Book 7. And then we will have Idomeneus' Aristeia. He will kill any number of people on the Trojan side, Othnius as well as Alcethus. And then finally, he will meet Aeneas face to face. We then have Menelaus, who is going to have a little Aristeia in this book. Pisander, he will kill. And then he will boast as well about it. And he'll have a very interesting speech that we're going to look at, where Menelaus will call war the great leveler. And that line has been used many times over the history of the West and our understanding of war. Paris will then enter. So notice in this book, when we had not heard a whole lot from either Menelaus or Paris, now all of a sudden they're back. It's almost like the poet, Homer or whoever that is, wants to remind us that we're here fighting because of these 2 men, and of course the woman who sits and kind of stands in the middle. Rarely do we see Helen in the Iliad, and yet she's always there, up on the Trojan walls, watching and that kind of thing, that kind of image, right? And Paris now will kill Eumachner, and then we have Polydamas, who's kind of a rival in some ways to Hector, or he's a wise thinker, and he says to Hector, we really need to get together and start planning. We then will have Hector, who will go in search of Paris, find Paris, and again will taunt him. And Paris will respond by saying, lead the way. It's an interesting dynamic. Anytime that we see these 2 together, we saw this obviously earlier when they were together at the conclusion of Book 6. And we'll see it again here, okay? And then finally we're told Zeus inciting all-out war. And then finally Hector will answer Ajax's taunt. And both sides, we're told, will scream and yell at each other. And the screaming, we're going to argue, is somewhat ironic. Because in the Iliad, you have 2 different kinds of screaming. You have screaming of ascension and victory. And of course, you have screaming, that is to say, sadness, because things are not going well. Let's turn now in the text. And we'll begin now with the opening lines. We often like to pay attention to the opening lines of these books. By the way, I should point out, as scholars always want to point out when we're studying the Iliad, that these these different kinds of divisions. For example, we're in book 13, for those of you who, have that notion that 13 is an unlucky number or whatever. You can use this as a mnemonic, right? But the notion is that, trichodexophobia, by the way, for those of you interested in the word. For those of you who kind of are paying attention to these books, though, and demarcations of the books, they are a contrivance, completely a contrivance. I mean, most scholars feel like it probably happened sometime in the city of Alexandria, about 300 years, 300 years BCE, that the poem started to be divided up into these different books. It literally was just a long poem. The papyri that was put on it probably took about 24 papyri, and therefore we have our books. Let's read opening lines. But once Zeus had driven Hector and Hector's Trojans hard against the ships. He left both armies there, milling among the holes to bear the brunt, wretching work of war, no end in sight, while Zeus himself, his shining eyes turned north, gazed a world away to the land of Thracian horsemen, the Mysian fighters hand to hand, and the lordly Hippolyte, but who drink the milk of mares, and the Abi, whose descent men alive. But not a moment more would he turn his shining eyes to Troy. In other words, Zeus starts all of this. Note the irony of this. And then he just decides to leave. I'm going somewhere else. Right? Zeus, the line, never dreamed, at line 910, Zeus never dreamed in his heart a single deathless god would go to war for Troy's or Achaea's forces now. It's the height of irony that the poet tells us that Zeus kind of does one of these numbers. Well, that's done and I'm glad it's over, to quote a line from T.S. Eliot's Wasteland. And he just decides to leave, assuming that no Greeks are going to get involved. In book 13, it's Poseidon. In book 14, it's, of course, Hera, his wife. Okay, so he goes off, he leaves the environs, and we're told the mighty god of earthquakes was not blind, Poseidon. He kept his watch, enthralled by the rush of battle aloft the summit of timbered Samos facing Thrace. From there, the entire Ida range swung clear in view. Now we're speaking, of course, of Zeus. The city of Priam clear and warships of Achaea, climbing out of the breakers. There Poseidon sat and pitied the Argives beaten down by Trojan troops. And his churning outrage rose against the father. So, in other words, now Poseidon will decide he's going to get involved, right? And as we have said already, books 11 through 18, playing the game of this longest day, fully a third of the Iliad is consumed with this information, right? And here we will have the continuation of Hector's Aristeia, right? But again, this notion that we've got, as I said before, a kind of reflexive reading of the Iliad, we have to kind of picture, I mean, think about it. You, the reader, or of course in the original, the listener, knows actually more than any other participant in the poem. I mean, think about that. Because you have this almost like bird's eye view of what's going on. You're aware, of course, of how this poem is going to end with the death of Hector. But before we get there, you're going to have the death of Patroclus. But before we get there, you're going to have Hector's Aristeia. And so you've got the work that the gods are doing and the work that humans are doing. And we've got different kinds of things happening all the way through this longest day series of books, right? Now, Poseidon will take on the form of Calchas. I'm with you now at line 53, 54, 55. The ocean king, Poseidon, who grips and shakes the earth, raising up from the offshore swell, urged the Argives, taking the build and tireless voice of Calchas. First the god commanded the great and little Ajax, hungry for war, as both men were already. Ajax, both of you, fight to save the Achaean armies. Call up your courage. No cringing panic now. At other points on the line, I have no fear of the Trojans' hands, invincible as they seem. Troops who had stormed our massive wall in force, our men-at-arms will hold them all at bay. But here, I fear the worst. I dread a breakthrough. Here, this firebrand, rabid Hector leads the charge, claiming to be the son of high and mighty Zeus. Now that's fascinating because at no point in the Iliad do we ever hear Hector claiming to be the son of a god. And this is what makes, and we're going to see in this book 2 different times, references to comparisons between Hector and Achilles, but they're made in a very interesting way. Notice it's Calchas that says, Hector thinks he's every bit the warrior that Achilles is. We have to prove him wrong, right? But the two of you, speaking again to the two Iaxes, but the two of you, if only a god could make you stand fast yourselves. Note the irony, obviously, this is Poseidon. Tense with all your power and command the rest of your men to stand fast too. Then you could hurl him, Hector, back from the deep sea ships, hard as he hurls against you, even if Zeus himself impels the madman on. And then we continue with this one when he meets other kinds of Greeks and Achaeans. I'm at line 110, 111, 112. He says, Poseidon pressed them on with winging charges. One of the questions we're going to ask at level 3, and I want you to write this down because I want you to be thinking about it. In your life, is it the case, athletes, of course, both love and hate this question, isn't it the case that at some point in your life, it's very possible that someone challenging you, okay, we'll even say at times taunting you, questioning your abilities or whatever, has challenged you to rise to an occasion and to be better? A coach that, for example, said, I don't know if you're good enough to do this or not. Why don't you give it a try and prove it? Now, there are some athletes that doesn't work with because they'll think that the coach is somehow doubting their ability and therefore they think they're inferior and then they give up. Other athletes, though, and warriors, in this text, warriors, will respond by saying, let me prove to you what I know to be true, and maybe you're questioning that. Notice here, shame, you Argives, raw recruits, and I trusted in you. Calchas, again, is the one speaking. So it's really Poseidon. Certain that if you fight, you'll save our ships. But if you hang back from the grueling battle now, your day has dawned to be crushed by Trojans. What disgrace! A marvel right before my eyes. A terrible thing. And I never dreamed the war would come to this. The Trojans advancing all the way to our ships. Men who up till now had panicked like deer. Food in the woods for jackals, leopards, wolves. Helpless, racing for dear life. All fight gone. From months on end, the Trojans would have no heart to stand and face the Argives' rage and bloody hands. Not for a moment. But now, quite exposed, far from Troy, they battle around our hollow ships thanks to our leader's weakness. Our army's slacking off. Who's he talking about, this weakness thing? Our men fight with him. Right? Obviously talking about Achilles, aren't we? They'd rather drop and die by our fast-trimmed ships than rise to their defense. And what if it's all true? And the man's to blame, lord of the far-flung kingdoms, hero Agamemnon, because he spurned the famous runner Achilles. How on earth can we hang back from combat now? Heal our feuds at once. Surely they can be healed, the hearts of the brave. How can you hold back your combat fury any longer? Not with honor, you, the finest men in all our ranks. Why, not even I would rail against that man, that worthless coward who cringes from the fighting. Again, there's this veiled kind of comment that Achilles is sitting in his tent. Maybe he is a coward, they think. Or Calchas is saying. But you, I round on you with all my heart. Weaklings, you'll make the crisis worse at any moment with this hanging back. Each of you get a grip on yourself. Where's your pride, your soldier's sense of shame? A great battle rises before us. Look, Hector, the king of the war, fights beside our ships, assaulting in all his force. Hector's crashed our gates. He's burst the tremendous bar. So in other words, note the sense of timing here. It's as if Hector's boulder from the last book has just smashed the gates down. And Calchas is saying, just because Achilles has withdrawn from the war, do not think that that is a sign for you to withdraw from the war, right? Calling him out. We're going to have some shouting in this book. Hector will shout, and book 13 will actually end with some shouting as well. And with shouting, he will scream a shrill cry at line 175, 76, 77. Trojans, Lysans, Dardans, skirmishers, hand to hand, stand by me here. They cannot, this is again Hector, they cannot hold me off any longer. These Achaeans, not even massed like a wall against me here. They'll crumble under my spear. Well I know if the best of immortals really drives me on, Hera's lord, whose thunder drums the sky. So in other words, continuation of the longest day. Hector has been told by Iris, the goddess, that Zeus is with him and he can fear absolutely nothing. Go to work. And in fact, we get a sense that Hector is in fact being guarded by Zeus in ways that are beyond human. For example, there's a very interesting little line tucked away in Book 13 that I want to point out to you at line 225 or so. Hector rushing in at Ajax. Ajax lunged with a spear, yet the burnished weapon could not pierce Hector's skin. Hector's whole body was cased in tremendous bronze. But Hector did stab home at the shield's jutting bulge, beating Hector back with enormous driving force. And he gave ground back and away from both corpses. He was trying to attack a corpse to get the armor. Now, for those of us, of course, who are aware of the story of Achilles getting dipped in the river Styx by his mama Thetis and having somehow a Teflon coating, we're playing an interesting game here that it's almost as if Hector cannot be wounded at this point, right? He's protected in bronze. Now, of course, the other way to read this is he's just got really good armor, right? But you get a sense it isn't going to be Hector who's going to get wounded in this project, at least not now, right? At this point now, we have the two Ajaxes who actually will cut off a Trojan's head, swing it around and throw it at Hector as a way to show Hector they're not afraid of him, right? We then will have the great Greek Idomeneus who is going to have his Aristeia, and this one for him, he begins his killing process, okay. And I'm with you now at lines 323 or so. The Cretan captain, Idomeneus, answers warmly, I know your style, your courage, no need for you to tell it. Now he's having this exchange here with Meriones, who has broken a spear and has run back behind the line to try and find a new spear. And so they're having an exchange. And the question obviously is, did your spear really break, and are you back looking for a new one? Are you looking for an excuse to not be out there in the middle of the melee fighting, right? And he says, I know your style, your courage, no need for you to tell it. If we all formed up along the ships right here, our best men picked for an ambush, that's where you really spot a fighter's mettle, where the brave and craven always